Chapter 2. He woke with a start, and it took a moment for him to remember where he was. He then tensed. What was it that had woken him? He reached out from the bag slowly and felt his rifle next to him. Feeling slightly less tense, he listened for a moment. Suddenly a blue jay called from above him, its raucous cry startling him. He laughed at himself. Just a bird, he thought. He looked around. It was a bright mid-October day. Indian summer, they called it, when the cold air and wind of fall was replaced with one final sign of the summer that had passed, and a reminder that the cold time was just around the corner. Releasing his L1A1, he unzipped his fart sack and stretched. He really was too old for this stuff, he thought. He smiled to himself. He sounded just like his old platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Chadwick. Hell, he was older now than old Sergeant Chadwick had been when he was platoon daddy for a bunch of miscreant recon soldiers back in the day. Getting out of the bag, he sat on the edge of his sleeping pad, which he still called a puss pad, often to his wife's dismay. He did have a way of letting things slip, which could be awkward when you were a middle management type for a stuffy brokerage firm. Pulling his pack towards him, he removed the cover and fished around inside. Removing a pair of dry polypropylene socks, as well as a pair of GI wool socks, removing the socks that he had slept in, a thick pair of wool hunting socks, he dusted each foot with foot powder before putting on the sock liner and GI sock. He then pulled on his hiking boots and laced them up. Stowing a sleeping bag in its compression bag, he placed that inside of a waterproof bag and returned it to the bottom compartment of his pack. He then took down his poncho hooch and returned its various components to their place in its outside pocket. Time for food, his rumbling stomach told him. He laid down the pack, unzipped the front compartment, taking inventory of his food supply. 5 Mountain House dehydrated meals. 7 MREs still in their heavy plastic bags. 12 stripped down MREs, all but the essentials removed to make them lighter and more compact. A large Nalgene bottle stuffed full of instant white rice, and a smaller one full of instant oatmeal. 6 ramen noodle packets, looking slightly worse for wear in their heavy-duty freezer bag. A small container of sugar, 1 of salt, and 1 of mixed spices. Sighing at his unappetizing breakfast fixings, he dug a small hole at his feet. Pulling an S-bit stove from the GI butt pack clipped to the top of the pack, he removed 1 heat tab, broke it in half, and returned 1 part to the stove, which he then replaced in the butt pack. Placing the tab at the bottom of the hole, he removed the canteen and canteen cup from the waist belt and filled the cup halfway with the remaining water. He then fished a disposable lighter from his pocket and, lighting the heat tab, placed a cup of water over it to boil. While the water heated, he took care of his morning toilet and took a moment to wash himself with a small face cloth he kept in his personal hygiene kit. He then dropped a ramen into the water, opened a stripped MRE, and removed a green foil packet of beef stew, which he opened and spooned into the canteen cup also. While waiting for the ramen stew to cook, he refilled his canteen from the water bladder in his pack, noting that he needed to find potable water before the next day started. After eating, he consulted his map. Fortunately, a company had been offering atlas that contained fairly large-scale topo maps of different regions of the country. He had purchased one for his state, Connecticut, which also covered diminutive Rhode Island, one for Massachusetts, where he was now, and one for New Hampshire, where he was headed. He had treated each map with a water sealer and kept them in a conveniently sized pocket on the front flap of the pack. With an alcohol pen, he marked his present position as close as he could determine. The next danger area for him was the Massachusetts Turnpike. He could cross at a less populous area, but that would take an additional 3 or 4 days of walking. He had long ago determined that this route was safe enough to risk crossing the highway at this point. Studying the map, he committed to memory the train ahead, noting the main roads, train tracks, and streams he would need to cross. A cemetery would provide a good spot to move through and not be seen, but most of the area ahead was suburbs. He would have to wait till dark and try to traverse 2 miles of backyards, sidewalks, and streets before reaching the largest danger area he would face on his trip. Restowing the maps, he dug around in the pack and removed 2 rectangular items. One was a small self-powered AM/FM shortwave receiver. Although it didn't have the shortwave frequency range he would have liked, its ability to produce power via a built-in dynamo was deemed a valid compromise. Winding the machine up, he plugged in a headset and plugged one earpiece into his left ear. Scanning the channels, he found the airwaves nearly dead. The only stations he could find were coming in so faintly and with so much static he could gain nothing from them, so he needed to pull out some help. Again opening the butt pack, he removed a small wire bundle that was his field antenna. Made from brown wire, it was a copy of the Jungle 292 improvised antenna used by the U.S. Army to improve transmission and reception of their often weakly powered FM radios. Tying the wire to a carabiner unclipped from his pack, he threw the beaner over a convenient tree limb and wrapped the wire around the small handle of the radio. As the AM antenna was mounted internally, this was as close as he could get the wire. It was crude, but scanning the AM band again, his reception was much better. And today, the European Union announced 15,000 men for the international security forces, providing security for the American people in light of the recent crisis. President Susan Billery welcomed the announcement, saying it was one more step towards restoring order in America. The President also announced that in light of the large, now defaulted debt owed to many of the governments in Europe and Asia, payment would be made in mineral and oil rights to many millions of until now protected area, including the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, areas of Utah and New Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and the forest in New England, the Pacific Northwest, and Michigan. The President had this to say: "My fellow Americans, today I take a great step forward in reducing the amount of debt faced by the American people. By letting our debtors utilize some of our untapped resources, they have agreed to forgive our debt on our defaulted Treasury notes and bills, in which they had invested considerable amounts of their nation's assets. I want to remind the American people that the foreign troops you may see are merely ambassadors of their respective governments, here to protect their interests until we are able to restore order." The announcer continued. While many members of the cabinet stood behind the President's announcement, Attorney General Bloss was to resign today, proclaiming that the turning over of sovereign American soil to foreign governments was tantamount to treason. However, he apparently decided that the pressure was too much for him, and Washington, D.C. police told us today that he died last night by his own hand with a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. We will now be signing off and will return to the air, as we always do, every 2 hours on the hour. This is SDFR Radio signing off. The radio went silent. Scanning the bands, both AM and FM, produced nothing. Sighing, he shut off the radio and removed the wire from the antenna. He then took out his Yaesu handheld shortwave receiver and connected the wire to its antenna. Plugging in the earpiece, he turned it on and started scanning the 2, 4, 6, and 10 meter bands. What he heard was nothing new or unexpected. Electricity was still out to all but government facilities and hospitals. The government had passed a decree against the possession of any rifle or pistol above 22 rimfire and any shotgun that held over 4 rounds in its magazine. Gasoline was also being rationed, and people were being encouraged to move to secure facilities, school gyms, churches, National Guard armories, where they could receive food and shelter. One operator even stated that his neighborhood, near an oil depot, was being forcibly moved the next day. He didn't feel he had any alternative but to comply. Food was being rationed, and new ID cards would be needed before month's end for anyone seeking government assistance. One ham even broadcast that his neighbor's house had been raided by foreign troops and local police, the occupants being taken away in a big tank, with 8 wheels and a cannon on top. He stopped broadcasting abruptly, as if someone had pulled the plug on his radio. Other reports had it that people who were more than 20 miles from their address of record, either that on their driver's license or newgovernment.org ID, were being detained unless they were able to show that they were staying with a local family. Well, Dave thought, Since they prevented people from traveling last week, no doubt they are rounding up a lot of folks. The whole reason he was trekking to New Hampshire from his home in northeast Connecticut was because a government edict preventing people from traveling on the interstate and local roads except for local trips. Police and National Guard checkpoints, as well as nosy sheeple looking for the reward of $10,000, were actually successful in shutting down almost all non-approved traffic in a matter of 2 days. After listening to the chatter and learning little more than what he expected, he took down and put away the antenna. Finding a sunny patch on the floor of the small clearing, he took the batteries from the Yaesu and put them in a small solar charger and put the charger in the sun. He then replaced the Yaesu's batteries with a charge set and put the radio away. Next, he turned his attention to his rifle. It was a home-built L1A1 kit on an M-Bell receiver. Dave had originally built it for himself, but had sold it to a friend when President Billary had finally passed her "turn them all in" law. As it was a duplicate of a rifle he already owned, he felt the sale was appropriate. His friend had immediately cached it, along with the chest pouch, 12 magazines, and 2 50 caliber ammo cans full of 7.62 ammo. Since Dave had actually sighted the rifle end and his friend had never shot it, he was confident that it was still dead on for his use. He unloaded the rifle and, using an STG-58 cleaning kit, wiped down the bore with a patch held in the pull-through thong. He wiped down the bolt and carrier with an oily rag and made sure the gas piston was moving freely. He then reassembled the rifle, as always taking care not to make any unnecessary noise. While reinserting the bolt, he dropped a round into the chamber and closed the bolt on it slowly, pressing it into battery with thumb pressure, thus avoiding the distinctive metallic clack of the bolt slamming home on a fresh round. Inserting the magazine, he touched the safety with his thumb, ensuring it was on. Again, reaching for the pack, he pulled the waist belt to him and removed an East German Makarov pistol from its nylon holster. He unloaded and checked the bore and wiped it with an oily rag, reloaded it, and replaced it on his belt. Ironic, he thought. I have 2 somewhat customized .45s in my stash, and here I am with a Bayard pocket pistol. Rolling up the pad, he attached it to the pack. Before securing the pack, he removed the Yaesu and earpiece. He then leaned against a tree and pulled the camouflage pack in front of him. He had a schedule. He also had to wait for sunset and wanted to wait for full dark before moving the highway. Hurrying was dangerous, and Dave had plans for the rest of his life. Those plans did not include federal detention.